Hey everybody. So, as human beings, we tend to fall into patterns on occasion. The reason the phrase history repeats itself carries so much weight is due in part to the fact that, if left to our own devices, we will very often go after the same things or create them ourselves if need be, over and over and over. One of the strongest trends among people is the ever-present desire for structure. We often seek order, rules, guidelines, a give and take of benefits and consequences to give us a little more direction. You can see this pretty much anywhere you look. Government, competitive events, household life, this natural trend towards creating structure is one of the most important ways in which we create and perpetuate what is commonly known as society, and to that end, civilization. It's one of the reasons true anarchy is very rarely seen. By now you're probably wondering what any of this has to do with Minecraft. Well, our human tendencies towards certain behaviors certainly extend into the realm of video games as well. And it's something you've probably seen on a day-to-day basis, that is, if you frequently play games. Even if the environment is a completely digital one, we still find ourselves setting up little societies of our own, no matter how big or how small. And on a Minecraft server devoted to upholding complete and utter anarchy, we may just find one of the closest things to real-world societal and cultural development the digital era has ever produced. Or maybe not. Let's talk about that. Let's take a look at human behavior. Society began anywhere from 100,000 years ago to just a few thousand, depending on who you ask. Tens of millennia ago, humans were found in loose hunter-gatherer groups that followed a nomadic way of life, traveling seasonal routes depending on the availability of food. Around 10 to 7,000 BCE, we began to develop major technologies and concepts that would prove integral towards building society. Beginning with the advent of agriculture, human groups all around the world began to see the rise of written and spoken language, religion, government, trade, and much more. From this point onward, societies and civilizations only grew more complex. And even today, humanity continues to perpetuate the development of society in more ways than one. Humans like to form structures and systems within groups, be it to differentiate between right and wrong through the establishment of norms, to designate leaders, to pass on traditions, and more. And, as stated previously, we can see this pretty much everywhere we look. This brings us to video games. They've been around for close to 50 years at this point, and each is designed with a sort of structure in mind. When a game is created, the creator establishes many things simply by the way they design the game. What is right and what is wrong within the confines of the game, what the end goal for the player is, how the various systems that make up the game universe are supposed to work, and so on. Every game is unique, each has its own structure. And when players pick the games up themselves and begin playing, they form another sort of structure entirely. There's a lot to be said about the culture that exists around games themselves through their communities and fandoms, but for this we'll be focusing specifically around player interactions within the boundaries of the games themselves. Within the established guidelines of games, if given the chance, people will create little ecosystems of their own. In any multiplayer environment, there's bound to be groups or clans that form through some means, trade that occurs between players, and a general shared sense of identity brought on by being collective players of the same game. Some would agree that this matches one of the definitions of a culture, a group of humans drawn together by a unifying trait. Some would even say that the groups formed within multiplayer games seem to emulate human society as a whole. But this isn't entirely accurate. When human beings originally formed civilizations and societies, there were none to begin with. With no pre-established cultural norms or organizational structures, they simply created their own. In a game, you can't really do this. When you form a group or a clan in a game, you're likely just doing it through pre-existing channels the game provided you with. When you make a trade, you're doing it with the in-game trading system. Every action you make is almost certainly within the preset bounds the game developer established. And this isn't a bad thing in any way. It just means that establishing something analogous to real-world culture and society within a game is remarkably difficult, simply due to the fact that most games don't have the openness or freedom for players to establish their own rules and structures, since these rules and structures have already been set in place by the game makers themselves. Enter Sandbox games. In simple terms, a sandbox game is a game that allows the player to do almost anything they want within the physical confines of the game itself. Unlike linear, story-driven, and even open-world games, sandbox games usually have no real objective and are designed to be an environment in which the player essentially makes their own game. They've existed for quite a while, and within the last decade have found great success with titles like Terraria, Garry's Mod, and most famously, Minecraft. Sandbox games are frequently known to inspire something called emergent gameplay, in which players, when provided with relatively simple game elements and tools, and placed in an aimless and open environment, will create their own complex game interactions rather than being presented with them by the game itself. Using the previously mentioned Gmod as an example, emergent gameplay would be a group of players creating a course and using in-game vehicles to race. In Terraria, this could be represented by a player building a fully functional computer system, which actually has happened in the past. These gameplay elements aren't present anywhere in the base game, but the players, having been given construction tools and an open environment, just create gameplay of their own. Now we're getting somewhere. This aimless environment, accompanied by simple tools and creativity, is what leads people to create structures of their own, or attempt to replicate that which they see in real life. This is why sandbox games often see some of the most complex player interactions and environments in the entire gaming arena. But this isn't the limit. We can go a little further. Enter Minecraft. It's often been hailed as one of the greatest and certainly the most popular sandbox games of the modern era, and for good reason. It is quite literally the best-selling game of all time, which is truly remarkable when you consider the fact that it has no real story, no real objectives, and the vast majority of the gameplay is left entirely up to the player. It's an exceedingly well-engineered sandbox experience, but most importantly, it strikes a critical balance that makes it ideal for player interaction. Minecraft is unbelievably customizable. Virtually every detail of the massive, procedurally generated world you're placed into can be altered in a myriad of ways. The game's creative mode, without limitations and more in line with classical sandbox gameplay, proves this time and time again. But at the same time, the game's survival mode poses an even more fascinating concept. Survival mode has limitations. The player needs to manage their health and hunger, gather resources, and defend themselves from a variety of threats. But at the same time, if enough work is put in, they can almost certainly accomplish almost anything that can be done in creative mode. In Minecraft Survival, your abilities are limited, but your potential is not. You have the openness and the freedom of a sandbox game, with the challenge and reward trade-offs of a survival game. Now, this is not unique to Minecraft, but Minecraft's massive player base means that we see this confluence of game elements in action far more frequently than anywhere else on multiplayer servers. But yet again, we run into a problem. Minecraft SMP, or survival multiplayer servers, often fall victim to a familiar issue. Most SMP worlds have extra limitations and structure imposed by their administrators. You can build here, but not there. You can only grief when permitted. You can form alliances through official channels. Systems and structures layered onto a normally structureless game and enforced by moderators and admins who hold ultimate power over the server's rules. And again, this is not a bad thing. It really isn't the best idea to give players free reign to do whatever they want to whoever they want in an open environment like Minecraft. But it means that, yet again, we can't really see the complex emergent interactions that we're looking for. Enter Anarchy servers. As the name implies, these are servers designed to be the counterpoint to the rule-driven SMPs mentioned previously. No rules, no limits, no guidelines, nothing, just infinite survival gameplay. Anarchy servers, good ones at least, aren't super common, and this is largely due to the fact that they're notoriously hard to run. When you let players do pretty much anything they want, you can be certain they're going to cheat, they're going to experiment, and they're going to find a method of exploiting the system any way they can. It's kind of like real life. And interestingly enough, as you've probably expected throughout this entire build-up, Anarchy servers are the exact environment we're looking for. The infinite potential and possibilities of a sandbox world, the somewhat realistic limitations imposed by survival gameplay, and the interactions of hundreds or even thousands of players in an environment with absolutely no rules to begin with. Here is a place where players can create their own structure, their own rules, their own society, all within the confines of a massive digital world. But there's a fair bit of Anarchy servers to choose from. You've got Constantium, 9B, Minewind, this one 1.17 server that I got banned from like a year ago. There's quite a few choices. Which will give us the ultimate Minecraft Anarchy experience? Well, I'm gonna stop beating around the bush. You've seen the title. B2T is old, very old. As many will tell you, in the realm of Anarchy servers, it is the oldest. And its story actually begins before the advent of Minecraft itself. In 2008, two Team Fortress 2 players named Housemaster and Kalash met on the popular 2 Fort 2 Furious server. After Housemaster was banned from the server for exploiting, he, along with Kalash and a few others, formed a no-rules Gmod server in August of that year. This server, which was run mostly by Housemaster, who kept much of his identity a secret, was named 2 Builders 2 Tools, in an obvious parody of 2 Fort 2 Furious, and was often simply called 2B2T. And the server enjoyed moderate popularity for a handful of years. A small amount of gameplay footage and screenshots do exist from this period. But in 2010, a new multiplayer sandbox game would catch Housemaster's eye. In December of 2010, Housemaster, along with another player named George Bush 420, would begin hosting a Minecraft multiplayer server under the same name as the Gmod one. While its original player base primarily consisted of the Gmod server members, it soon saw an increase in popularity as it was advertised across 4chan, Something Awful, and eventually the Facepunch forums. And the rest was history. 2B2T has been running for over 11 years at this point, maintaining its Anarchy setting all the while. The server's map has grown to a size of almost 12 terabytes, and the server has seen over 600,000 players join at one point or another. It's received worldwide media attention and is well known by millions who haven't even visited it. And it is quite possibly one of the closest approximations of societal development any game has ever seen. It can be argued that 2B2T has developed its own civilization. Let me explain. Words like civilization, culture, and society, which I admit I've been using quite frequently, are a little hard to define. Even anthropologists who study these concepts have some disagreements of what exactly they entail, but essentially, in extremely broad terms, they all describe different aspects of groups of people who form a somewhat cohesive unit based on shared traits. A society is a group of human beings involved in social interaction. Culture is the collection of beliefs, traditions, norms, and values that they share, and civilization is a developed form of any society characterized by a few notable traits. And if we go by these definitions, 2B2T matches each. Thousands of players participate in the server each and every day, and they all communicate and socialize through various means. Alongside this, they're characterized by the shared identity of being 2B2T players. This alone fits societal definitions quite well, but there's more. Language is an interesting one. While 2B2T doesn't technically have a defined official language, over time it's developed a sort of technical language of its own, composed of various slang terms and jargon from the game and server itself. But a lot of games have this, so let's go further. Food is grown with the game's farming system. A massive trade system thrives across all corners of the server. Political and governmental movements rise and fall in the course of months and years. New technologies and techniques are developed, and the server even abounds in complex art, architecture, and symbolism, drawing inspiration and influence from earlier works the server has seen. Over the course of 11 years, it can even be said that 2B has seen civilization, centralized hubs of activity like group bases, great works of architecture that take months or years to complete, division and specialization of labor, with different players becoming masters of their trades, and even minor ideologies of sorts. None of this was developed in any way by the server owner or the game makers themselves. It was all created and perpetuated by the thousands of players making up the society of 2B2T. Let's look at some concrete examples of how 2B2T has achieved a society and civilization of its own. Now, it's actually quite easy to do this, because over time the countless stories of 2B2T have become detailed enough that there are historians and archivists dedicated to documenting its complex history. I'll reiterate, this Minecraft server has historians who've dedicated their time to writing down its history. And through their work we can see some of 2B's most interesting occurrences throughout the last decade. War is a common occurrence. In the proverbial dark ages of 2B2T, the early 2010s, two major groups, a loose coalition of 4chaners and an influx of new players called the Face Punch Republic, did battle in a series of wars over the course of a year. This was followed by a number of other major conflicts, like 2016's Russia War, which saw thousands of in-game casualties. Other movements take place as well, such as the incursions, which involve a group seizing control of the server's spawn for a brief period of time, creating forward operation bases at the hotly contested spawn region. The server has engineers and technicians that push the boundaries of the game's system, creating devices and exploits that do anything from carpet bombing entire bases to causing temporary immortality. It has a thriving automated trade system / black market that involves players selling powerful in-game items obtained through questionable means for real-world money. At one point, 2B even had something eerily close to a holy site, a sanctuary known as the Valley of Wheat, which was almost universally respected and undisturbed by players, and was frequently visited by new players on pilgrimages. When the site was eventually destroyed by the Resistance, a Russia War-era splinter group, the Resistance found themselves subject to what could be considered a cultural taboo, being shunned by many members of the server for their actions. All of these bizarre occurrences and phenomena are virtually unheard of on any server other than 2B2T, and for that matter, in almost any game entirely. So why 2B2T? Well, part of it relates to the emergent gameplay aspect described earlier. You have thousands upon thousands of Minecraft players thrown into an environment with infinite creative potential and essentially no rules, and left to fend for themselves and create whatever they see fit. This is essentially what drove human beings to create culture, society, and civilization in the first place. And it seems that whether the environment is the real world or a digital one, people will retrace the exact same steps they once performed. Another key aspect is the server's age. As stated before, Anarchy servers have a tendency to not last very long, simply because they're just so remarkably difficult to maintain. Most end up shutting down over a few years, or resetting the server and the map, which is essentially the same thing to many players. But not 2B. 2B2T has had the same map, the same rules, the same environment for all 11 years of its existence, and this comparatively massive amount of time has allowed the emergent player interactions to grow from something minor into a full-blown saga of epic proportions. 2B2T, for a Minecraft server, has real history, and its players continue to build on this history each and every day the server remains running. And when I say that these events and interactions have gotten complex, I really mean it. One of the things that makes real-life history so interesting is the level of nuance and detail with any event you look at, how historical occurrences flow into one another and have their influences felt years down the line. Stories never really end, they just change form. You might have two warring nations, one backed by superior numbers and one headed by great leaders with superior technology. They might have a massive conflict that ravages the countryside before one side is forced back to its final stronghold, being beaten and having their fortress destroyed and buried in rubble. But then years later, that fortress might be rediscovered by curious nomads. Later still, it might be retaken and restored by one of the conquered faction's original leaders in an effort to reform the vanquished nation. Now, what I described to you is not in fact a real-life event, but something that happened on 2B2T, centered around the spawn-based 2K2K from the events of the Facepunch 4chan War to the formation of the Facepunch Federation under the player Cheesehead. Stories so complex you'd think they could only happen in real life can and will be documented on 2B2T, and it's only because of the great freedom players are afforded and the staggering age of the server that we get to see these virtual sagas play out. Even extremely niche concepts have their own 2B parallels. For instance, the server has its own form of archaeology. You see, a common practice when bases are destroyed, whether in war or individual attacks, is lava casting, the act of encasing a build in stone with lava and water. This is often done repeatedly, usually interspersed with mass demolitions, until very little remains of the base but smoke and dust. In a way, this emulates the destruction and weathering of historical relics in the oldest part of the world, but what's really interesting is what comes next. Players may journey to the ruined sites of ancient bases and dig through the lava casts to find what remains, and often they discover things thought to be long destroyed. The previously mentioned 2K2K was a legendary base thought to have been destroyed for years following the conclusion of the Facepunch War, but in the mid-2010s it was found that entire portions of the base remained intact and entirely untouched, buried beneath a mountain of stone for years undisturbed before being discovered by 2B2T's amateur archaeologists. And there's much, much more. 2B has its own architects and engineers who plan and orchestrate massive public works projects, like the player Thebes and Sound, who founded the Southern Canal Corps to dig and maintain a canalway hundreds of in-game kilometers long. Every war and political movement has its own factions and splinter groups, which break off to further their own ends or simply profit off the conflict. The server has its own form of arms races, with players working around the clock to discover new exploits and techniques to gain an upper hand. Many of the largest conflicts were driven by recent developments of duplication technologies, which allowed for nearly infinite resources. Occasionally, a new or dangerous backdoor or exploit will be discovered by an individual or group, causing a massive cultural upheaval on 2B, like Nerds Inc.'s third backdoor and their subsequent week of destruction, in which several major bases were obliterated within days and faith in the server was shaken. In many cases, these backdoor events will leave behind mysterious and powerful objects and weapons that become highly sought after over time. To commemorate major events or accomplishments, truly massive bases may be constructed by entire teams of players over the course of weeks or months. When Berenguer and the Positive X digging group encountered the server's world border, the quite literal edge of the world, they constructed Point Nemo, representing the farthest point any group had traveled since a backdoor in 2013. The group Valkyria, during their third incursion of the spawn region, constructed a massive monument known as Wrath Outpost, designed to weather nearly any attack and stand for years after its construction. On rare occasions, players will construct astoundingly massive structures that rival those built by players in creative mode, like Jack the Ripper's Space Valkyria 3, a kilometer-wide space station made in response to the destruction of a previous base. Although these rarely last more than a year, structures like this often become wonders of the 2B2T world. The server even has its own legendary figures of sorts, like Pyrobite, who became legendary through his actions as a member of Valkyria and was eventually informally dubbed the King of 2B2T, and Jared 2013, who became famous for his immensely prolific griefing career. And just to remind you, every last thing I've mentioned occurred on a Minecraft server. But hold on a second, let's take that back. "2B2T, for as many parallels and equivalents as it may have to real-world society, really is just a Minecraft server. And simply due to this fact, it can never truly emulate real-life behavior. There's a number of reasons for why this is, some more obvious than others, but there is one key factor that makes all the difference when it comes to the behavior of players on the server: consequences. One of the factors that motivates our actions is the balance between rewards and punishments. While not always the case, we'll sometimes take action in pursuit of some benefit or avoid it because of some consequence. This can weigh in even more heavily when it comes to avoiding things like committing crimes. You might be less inclined to do them simply because you know the result won't be too good for you. Obviously, this shouldn't be the driving force behind being a good person. That should just be something you do on your own, but you get the point. There are things we just won't do because the cost is too great. 2B2T fundamentally lacks this. There's a distinct lack of permanence on the server. Nothing lasts forever, and in many cases nothing lasts more than a few months, be it player, build, alliance, or exploit. All bases get destroyed, all players get killed, and all groups eventually disband. And there's no real downside to any of this because, well, it's a video game. Almost anything can be rebuilt, recreated in another world, or reinvented. And even when something is lost, it's not like it's that big of a deal since it really is just bits of data on a Minecraft server. Even the resources on the server are functionally unlimited, simply due to the world's gigantic size and the comparatively small player base. But the biggest difference of all comes with the impermanence of death. Death is the ultimate consequence, many would agree. It's arguable that it's the greatest price you can pay, the most feared punishment, and certainly the most final thing that can ever happen to a human being. On 2B2T, it's more of a minor inconvenience. If you fall while bridging, find yourself spawn killed by roaming players, or get ambushed on the highways, you can always just respawn right back at your bed and get right back into whatever you were doing. In fact, the biggest consequence on 2B2T isn't even death at all. It's usually having a build destroyed or a valuable item lost or your IP address leaked, but that's a story for another time. All in all, the fundamental difference between 2B2T's digital civilization and that which we see in the real world is a fundamental absence of any lasting consequence, punishment, or cost for any action a player may take. So what becomes of this difference? How does it affect the way interactions play out on 2B? Well, by now you've probably noticed that the words war, destruction, exploit, and kill have come up significantly more often than one might expect in this discussion of 2B's history. And therein lies the big difference. By nature, 2B is more unstable, dangerous, and for lack of a better term, explosive than real-world society could ever be. If every consequence, even death itself, was nothing more than a temporary setback, you'd probably feel more comfortable with throwing yourself into a deadly fray, laying waste to a masterwork piece of building, or causing grievous damage to the landscape, simply to say that you did. In real life, blowing up the pyramids of Giza isn't something many would even consider doing, and yet on 2B2T, players willingly go out of their way to destroy things like Ziggy Base's Bedrock Dam, or Imperator's Base, essentially historical monuments of their own, and even take the act of griefing them as a sort of badge of honor. Such is the way of life on 2B2T. You fight, you kill, you build, you destroy, you live fast, die hard, then get back up and start living again. 2B2T can never truly emulate the civilizations of reality, not just because it lacks rules, but also because it is something fully impossible to realize in the real world, a realm of infinite potential and non-existent repercussions. It's one possible glimpse into a world where consequences don't truly exist, and although it's impossible to know for sure if that's how it would all play out, it's a fascinating experiment nonetheless. After all this, it's important to remember that 2B2T really is just a server in a video game. No matter how closely it parallels real-world occurrences, or how enthralling its history may be, it will always be just that. but in a way that makes it so much more remarkable. It's an environment 40,000 years in the making, something that quite literally would not have been possible had it not been for the technological advancements of the past few decades. A vibrant, if not immensely chaotic, virtual plane, with no direction but that which the player imposes on themselves, no limits but that which the player is not willing to overcome, and no rules but those which the player chooses to create. It's unlikely Housemaster and the original 2B players could have ever imagined that 10 years down the line, this simple Anarchy server would have a thriving culture and years of intricate stories to tell, all created solely by the players who inhabit it. Yes, in all honesty, it is just a Minecraft Anarchy server, populated by very unusual people. But it is also a remarkable look into what a digital civilization can truly be. We can only hope it stays that way long into the future. Thanks for watching.